Welcome, everyone. My name is Ed Pulsifer, and I am the Director of Sales here at the Fonda. I've been here 10 years. This is my 37th year in the hospitality industry, all in New Mexico, and I'm also the hotel historian. And I am very proud to introduce someone I've known since the late 80s, Bradbury Reid. I was at Sheraton Old Town from 86 to 99 and used to work with Ellen on hosting Recursos de Santa Fe tours down in Old Town Albuquerque. And Ellen grew up in Los Alamos as the daughter of a Manhattan project engineer, and she'll recall encounters with Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the project. She shares unique perspective of a youngster's life within the confines of a closely guarded community. Reid, who knew Edith Warner personally, operates Recursos de Santa Fe, providing tours and programs on the city's unique history. So, and one idea Ellen had is to serve the Robert Oppenheimer martini, which we're serving complimentary to that. It's the cocktail of honey and lime, very dry gin martinis, recommended to keep the gin in the freezer, and then the martini glass is dipped in lime juice and then honey. So they're complimentary to that, and there's sodas and coffee. So I am proud to introduce Ellen Bradbury Reid.
Thank you all so much for coming, and we're delighted to see all of you. Many thanks to Fonda, Ed, Jenny, and all the people who just brought in the extra chairs. Is that working? Is it working? Closer. Okay, I can do that. That's better. Okay. So the idea of this afternoon event came sort of when realized that Alton Walpole, who I'd known a long time, was working on the same story that Bruce has been working on for both of them, maybe 35 or 40 years, which is the story of Edith Warner and her little tea room at Otowi Bridge. And it's a story that's been, there are 2 books about it, there's been an opera, but today, I don't know that, I mean, it sort of falls in and out of favor. It's a lovely, lovely little book. So what we're going to do is sort of set up the context of Los Alamos and how it got to be where it is, why. And then we have the 2 filmmakers, writers, producers, who will talk about their various efforts to turn these 2 books, with really one story, into a movie with various people being, women being Edith Warner, and the cast that's probably well known to many of you. But, my phone will probably do that too. I wanted to just give a little tiny bit of personal history, and then Jim is going to give you more of the setup, the background of how the Manhattan Project came to be in Los Alamos. But I'm going to jump in a little first and say what happened to my family. My father was a chemical engineer, and some of you will know this, but there were 2 bombs, the uranium bomb, plutonium bomb, and they found that the plutonium did not detonate with a gun detonator, which is they had presumed would work, it didn't. So at the last minute, there was a huge crisis at the lab. Oppenheimer even considered resigning. And they decided that they would reorganize the lab and get a team of men, they're all men, who would work with high explosives. And so my father was on that team. They were brought in at the last minute, and what they did was detonate at Los Alamos in the early years, well, late years of 44, early 45, they were trucking 25 tons of high explosives up to Los Alamos on a very bad road, blowing that up a month. So when we were growing up and went to school, we knew that there were explosions at 10 and 12 and 3 because they were timed, so you knew it wasn't an accident. And I talked to someone who went through school with me, I said, did we have a school bell? And he said, no, we had those explosions. Recess, lunch, and school's over. So, you know, kids are very adaptable. We just figured this out. It was fun for us. But anyway, we lived, when Daddy came, there was no housing. Los Alamos was notoriously short of housing. And we ended up living in a tent in the bottom of Bandolier because there was no housing. And so for kids, it was great to live in a tent. And Daddy drove up to work every day at S-Sites. It was very close to S-Site. And those of you probably know Los Alamos, the conventional explosive part that they knew would detonate was always separate from the town. So he could get to S-Site right away and go on blowing things up. But, anyway, as you all know, it has still very excellent schools, interesting place to live. But in that intense pressure cooker of Los Alamos, and what they were trying to do, which Jim is going to talk about more, was something that had never been done before. And so there was no rule book. And my father remembers when he got to Los Alamos, he was called in by Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer explained that they were going to try to squeeze a piece of plutonium until it fissioned. And Daddy said, well, I don't know how to do that. And Oppenheimer said, I don't either, so you figure it out. And that was the end of the interview. So, which I think is a little window into the way Los Alamos worked. You just went ahead and figured things out. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend, Jim Hopkins, who's from SMU with a distinguished history in all sorts of subjects, but particularly Jim and I have worked together in many different circumstances, telling different parts of the story of the Manhattan Project. So he will tell you how Los Alamos came to be and the situation in the world at that time.
Long ago, it's very difficult to follow Bill Bradbury. I always feel like I'm sort of pay to leave afterwards, and I thought we really got the best of us right here.
Microphone closer.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Is it all right? Not so good? Okay, better?
Much better.
Okay. Well, my name is Jim Hopkins, and I said Ellen and I have been friends for a long time. I'm a historian, I'm not a scientist, and I'd like to share with you my own journey to my father, in a way. On the night of March the 21st, Good Friday, 1951, my mother received a telephone call, and I can still see this is the last night. And my father had been gone many times during World War II, and then afterwards he stayed with the Strategic Air Command. And I looked at her face, and I knew for the first time it was very bad news. What resulted was the loss of 52 officers and men on a single aircraft, all of them experienced in atomic warfare. The official story was the plane exploded in air, and there might have been a couple of survivors, but in the course of a few hours they were washed away. The plane disappeared. There were no bodies the next day. There were a few pieces of wood. And that haunted me, but it seemed to be a closed story. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. There was much more to it than just that day. So I grew up, and at the age, the first book I ever read was John Hersey's Hiroshima. And it is a book that's written with the simplicity of the parable. It's very easy to read, and it's the kind of book that changed your life. I'd grown up in a small East Texas town. My father, as so many small towns, had contributed any number of young men to the war with appropriate casualties and what we know now as PTSD, etc. And in that small town, my father, because he'd helped plan the missions against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was a kind of hometown hero. And I bask in this reflected quote. If I wanted to see how a fire station worked, the fire station would open up, and I'd climb up on the pole and be very grateful to my father for the special privileges. Or swim in the YMCA pool on a Sunday because they opened it for my father. And yet I was 9 years old when he disappeared or died. It's still quite unclear what happened. And I began my own journey. I think the reading of Hiroshima, was the occasion of looking at the experience of destruction of those two Japanese cities, from below as well as from above. This afternoon I've talked a little bit about the vision from above, but we're also going to be looking at Edith Warner in short multi-lens, from those who carried out the attack mission, to those scientists who made it possible, to those scientists like Oppenheimer, who were as much moralists as they were scientists, reflecting in a meditative state for the rest of their lives about the part that they played in an activity that changed the fate of our world. As I was teaching history at SMU, the journey really to my father began. Hiroshima, yes, the book, and I moved from book to book in a very rich inventory of biographies and studies in the Manhattan Project and the principal figures, in fact, who made it one of the most astonishing intellectual achievements of modern history. So today I'd like to take you on that journey. Again, not being a scientist, not being able to read you with the specificity that the science could, but in fact to accompany me in trying to understand in a kind of general way, indeed, the extraordinary individuals, the circumstances that were unique, and the ultimate culmination and decision to invent and use a weapon that could cause the destruction of mankind. The moral implications, the political implications, some of these we'll go into, some of them will kind of skate over. But it's a journey that's been enormously rewarding for me, in a sense, has made it possible for me to reconnect with my father. In November, we went to Arlington, and after a 2-year negotiation with the Arlington National Cemetery, we finally got the stone there. And I was thinking about many of these things we're going to talk about this afternoon on that beautiful October day, and remembering a man whom I never knew well, but in one way or another has played an enormous important role in my own life. And I hope the circumstances of his being a young man, as there were millions of young men and women during this period, are living through one of the most difficult and challenging times in world history, to bring them down to this extraordinary enterprise and introduce you to some of the most remarkable men and women as well. We've paid much gratitude to women in ways that we wouldn't have earlier, and so a kind of balance is intended to be restored. So first of all, I'd like to go back to the very beginning of this extraordinary intellectual enterprise that seemed to be, as Ernest Rutherford said, the director of the Cavendish Laboratory, 12 years before the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, any idea, Rutherford said, leader of the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University, any idea that there would be any practical implication to this examination of these subatomic particles and what they might mean in terms of knowledge, in terms of human experience. He said in an interview with the Times of London in 1933 that it is the merest moonshine to think there's any practical implication. 12 years later to the day, Paul Tibbets, the commander of the Enola Gay, named after his mother the night before, descended upon the city of Hiroshima and began the atomic age. Now the beginnings. In the first years of the 20th century, Albert Einstein was an obscure patent clerk in Zurich. His farewell gift from his secondary school which he attended was a tutor of his who said, "You will never amount to anything." Now, thus supposedly taking this as a challenge, Einstein entered perhaps his most fecund period of scholarship. In 1905, he published an article in the Scholarly Journal in which for the first time his famous formula for the conversion of mass into energy appeared. And I think most of us at least have nodding points with that. Energy equal mass times the speed of light squared. Now what did this mean? There are books about what it means, but in sum, what it meant was the material world in which we live has, under certain circumstances, the ability to be liberated of energy. That mass and energy are separate entities, and that one can be converted into the other. And so Einstein carried out an intellectual revolution that made us look at the material world in a revolutionary way. Now, at the end of the war, James Conant, one of the principal leaders of the Manhattan Project, thought back over the history of the development of the most destructive weapons that humankind has ever manufactured. He said, "They won't believe you when the time comes that this can be told. It is more fantastic than Jules Verne." You recall that Jules Verne was the writer of early science fiction. It was a fantastic story, and it's a story that deserves retelling. The story was one of heroic purpose and unprecedented destruction. More than that, however, as a great chronicler of the atomic bomb, Richard Rhodes said, "The 20th century, a time in which mankind invented the means of its own destruction." Also, it's a story about human beings, their hopes, their fears, the choices they made, and the consequences for all of those who would come afterwards. The discovery that led directly to the creation of the atomic bomb was made by German scientists in the 1930s, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, who split uranium atoms in Nazi Germany. And 2 weeks later, Lisa Meitner, who should have won the Nobel Prize, was disqualified by the fact she was a woman, effectively. She and her nephew, Otto Frisch, in fact explained what happened. What had happened was that if uranium atoms were bombarded with neutrons, they would split into nearly equal parts. New elements would be formed, and the release of some of the resulting mass would appear as energy. And thus the intellectual footsteps to August of 1945 began to be made. And there were those who were keen enough, aware enough to realize that the implications of those experiments in Germany in the 1930s would in fact have a good deal more than moonshine to recommend them. It was immediately apparent to physicists throughout the world that nuclear fission could lead to a new weapon of unimaginable destructive power, but only if it could bring about what an obscure Hungarian named Leo Szilard called a chain reaction. Now, Szilard was one of several Hungarian physicists, largely unknown to the larger world, but in Budapest, in a neighborhood of 1.5 or 2 miles, there grew a quartet of some most extraordinarily gifted, talented, and changers of an older world into a modern world. Leo Szilard was one, Edward Teller, the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb, was another, John Neumann was the co-inventor of the computer, and Eugene Wigner won the Nobel Prize in 1963 for his work on subatomic particles. These four, in fact, growing up in this neighborhood, made Richard Rhodes call them the men from Mars. Later in Chicago, Szilard, who was a ubiquitous figure in the great story of the making of the atomic bomb and its use later on in 1945, was talking to Enrico Fermi, the great Italian physicist who had recently fled Mussolini's Italy, and was in fact the principal scientific actor in Chicago, carrying out the first chain reaction. There was something called the Fermi paradox, and it went like this. Fermi said there must be intelligent life in the world. I went down to Roswell this week and realized that intelligent life, more or less, was in fact something that certainly Fermi was deeply committed to. He said the thing is, why haven't they come to this beautiful planet in which we live? And Szilard, standing next to him, said, Enrico, he said, they have come. They're called Hungarians. Now this was the first time that stellar intellects from Hungary had been characterized in quite that extraordinary way. Now, as the Nazi Empire spread across Europe, the challenge was clear. Could enough fissionable material be accumulated to make a bomb? If German science was successful in achieving this first, Hitler would be victorious. And James Conrad, one of the leaders of the Manhattan Project, said, without any qualification or doubt, whoever gets this first will win the war. And we have to keep this in mind at every step of the way about what was motivating the scientists who, in certain respects, were at the pinnacle of their careers during this time, 27 months in Los Alamos. Now, many physicists fleeing the continent came to the United States, but because they were foreigners, it was very difficult to get an audience. And Szilard, despite his own incontestable merits, was largely unknown, and others, in fact, who later would rise to prominence, similarly, because they were foreigners, quote, quote, were on the periphery of scientific research in the United States. Now, at the end of the summer of 1939, Szilard was absolutely convinced that a bomb would be made. And he had no difficulty persuading his fellow Hungarians, Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner, that in fact Americans had got to be awakened to the fact that what was going on in Germany could result in the Germans in fact creating an atomic weapon. And so they decided on an extraordinary propaganda stroke. The most famous scientist in the world was Albert Einstein. He had left Germany, he had seen what was happening there, he was a marked man, he was on Hitler's hit list. He had immigrated to the United States, was living on Long Island, and these three young Hungarian physicists decided to make a personal appeal to Albert Einstein. So they rented a car and drove to Long Island and looked without effect for where Einstein lived. And finally, Leo Szilard said, perhaps it was fate that intended us not to find Professor Einstein. At that moment, peering through the glass of his automobile, he saw a child standing in the corner, about 7 years old. The child had a fishing rod, and Szilard went out to talk to him. And one can imagine today, if your child was 7 standing in the street corner, was accosted by a man in a dark blue suit who could not speak English very well, that perhaps should arouse the neighborhood. But it was a peaceful place, and the child said, yes, he said, it's 2 blocks down and you take a ride and Professor Einstein will be there. So he did just that. And Szilard had prepared to draft a letter, 625 words, that probably the most influential 625 words of the 20th century. In this letter, Einstein, which had been signed after he read it, simply noted to the President of the United States that the activities in German science were leading to the very real possibility that the Germans, in fact, could create an atomic weapon. Armed with the 625-word letter, they returned to D.C. and mailed the letter to President Roosevelt. It came to Roosevelt's desk, and Roosevelt looked at it very quickly and simply pushed it to the side. But he had an advisor, Alexander Sachs, who was a lawyer, a close advisor to Roosevelt, who had read the letter before it appeared on Roosevelt's desk. That day, before leaving the White House, Sachs persuaded President Roosevelt to meet him for breakfast in the morning. Sachs went to a hotel, couldn't sleep. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he went to nearby park, sat on the bench, and a story occurred to him, the story of Robert Fulton, who was the inventor of the steamboat. In 1804, Napoleon was on the verge of invading Great Britain. The problem was command of the English Channel. It was true in 1804, it was true in 1940, when the Spitfires and other British aircraft were able to fend off the Germans at a crucial moment in the national and world history at that time. So Fulton got an interview with Napoleon, trying to persuade him that if he adopted his steamboat, that his troops, Napoleon had assembled 100,000 troops in Boulogne, they could cross the channel very quickly and in fact carry out the assault on Great Britain. Napoleon listened and quickly dismissed Fulton. But Sachs remembered the story, and the next morning he went to the White House and he told President Roosevelt the story. And Roosevelt responded, and he said, Alex, what you're after is to see the Nazis don't blow us up. He called his attaché and said, this requires action. And then he called for a bottle of Napoleon brandy and brought it from the cellar of the White House. And so this faltering, uncertain beginning of a project that was to change the world in which we all live had its beginnings with a story about Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804. So thus it began. The first chapters of the story were very indecisive and fumbling. The British, in fact, were in the forefront of nuclear research, as well as the emigre scientists from Germany and indeed Hungary who had brought their talents to the United States. Now, it should be remembered that these emigre scientists were part of a larger armada of the intellectual depopulation of Europe. In Germany, for example, there were 1,600 scientists, humanists, and others who were, because they were Jewish or because they were politically active, in fact were exited from their academic jobs. Of these, about 600 of them were physicists. And of these 600 physicists, 22 were Nobel Prize laureates. Overnight, what one historian has described the United States science as being the Appalachia of world science. Overnight, the United States became the leader in world science. And it was not understood well at the time that this depletion of all this talent from Germany was going to result in serious roadblocks in building an atomic weapon, because most of the most talented, in fact, had come to the United States, and many of them were at Los Alamos. Now, in August of 1940, the British convinced us that the separation of U-235 and the heavier U-238 that was critical. U-235 was vulnerable to a chain reaction, whereas the parent element was not. They convinced us that a uranium fission bomb could be made, but not in Great Britain. Great Britain was trying to survive the Blitz. Cities were aflame. The possibility of fabricating an establishment that required secrecy had the had the composure, if you will, to do this kind of extraordinary, unique, and world-changing research was simply impossible. So the idea was that the ship had moved from Great Britain, from Germany to Great Britain, into the United States. Now the challenge and triumph of the Manhattan Project was largely completed with science up in 1939. The real challenge after that were in technology and scientific administration. By 1939, science had pretty much done its job. Now for both scientists and engineers, it was an extraordinary time. The person who was chosen to lead this special project was J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was to become one of the most extraordinary and revered figures in world science. As one observer said, among a mass of very clever men, he was probably the cleverest. Now what was the goal? Well, the project itself had its roots in Manhattan, therefore the Manhattan Project. It was taken over by General Leslie Groves, whose earlier triumph had been the building of the Pentagon. And when he was told he was not getting a combat command in Europe, he became, as one biographer said, the angriest man in the United States Army, taking his birthday cake that day and smashing it against the wall. I'm told that other high-ranking figures can all smash things against the wall. The East Coast and the West Coast in different ways were vulnerable, according to Groves, and he'd been commissioned to find a place where the intellectual and engineering work would be completed in comparative solitude. Now, Oppenheimer was his choice, and it was the most improbable choice. Oppenheimer had never administered anything. One friend of his said he had never been a departmental chair. Another friend said he couldn't manage a hamburger stand. So the idea that Groves would select Oppenheimer as a leader of the most sensitive part of the sprawling Manhattan Project from Hanford in Washington to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with Los Alamos being in the middle, was improbable, to put it charitably. But Groves, in fact, had fallen under Oppenheimer's spell. Now, Oppenheimer himself, Groves knew very little about his background. He used to learn a great deal more in the 27 months at Los Alamos. But Oppenheimer came from a privileged family. What separated Oppenheimer, I think, from his compatriots, from his peers, was the education he received and, of course, his own personal inclinations. He was educated at an ethical culture school in New York City that was run by Felix Adler, who was a pioneering educator. Adler's educational activities were particularly attractive to Jewish students and Jewish parents. These were students and parents who wanted to maintain their Jewishness, but at the same time embrace a wider view of the world that in one way or another could be affected by the ethics and principles of the Jewish faith without in fact being necessarily a true believer in the faith. And so in this school, Adler in fact was to offer to the students a way of looking at themselves, at their life possibilities, as their potential as human beings to put an impact, make an impact in the world that in one way or another would be reflective of the values that were cherished by a faith that no longer had the same commanding effect on their intellects and lives, but nevertheless which they embraced a wider culture, a world in which opportunity was there, a world in which individuals, in fact, in one way or another, were to be viewed as irreplaceable, the preciousness of individual life. Now, in Oppenheimer's case, his experience at the Ethical Cultural School really was a transformative period in his life. He did brilliantly there. He went to Harvard. He graduated at the age of 19. He went to Cambridge for an ill-fated year, studying in the Cavendish Laboratory, which was extremely ill-suited to do. He was a theoretical physicist, and that, in fact, was not very much in vogue in the Cavendish Laboratory in the 1930s. This had been Rutherford's great achievement, James Chadwick's great achievement. And Oppenheimer, in fact, had, I'll simply say, a kind of mixed notice on the year that he spent there. At one point, he was said to have threatened to poison one of his instructors, who later win a Nobel Prize by leaving a poisoned apple on his desk. The provost of the college where Oppenheimer was phoned his father. His father immediately flew to the United States and was able to extract his son from this highly delicate situation. Oppenheimer simply experienced a nervous breakdown. He, in fact, within a short period of time, was moved to Germany, which was the high point of world physics. And he studied at the University of Göttingen. His patron, intellectual patron there, was Max Born, who was a Nobelist. Born, in fact, cultivated that which was the very best in Oppenheimer. The day came for Oppenheimer to defend his thesis for his PhD, and Born discovered that Oppenheimer had never registered as a student. So he was not eligible to take a degree because he never officially been a student there. So Born went to the rector of the University of Göttingen, and implored him to make this one-time historical exception. So on one day, Oppenheimer registered as a student and received his PhD. Now this was the kind of thing that made his contemporaries, and many of them also educated in Germany, that's where world physics was at its zenith, to have very little confidence in his administrative abilities. But Groves did see something, and what he saw, he said, was a man who seemed to know everything. And then Groves ticked off the list of things that he could converse with Oppenheimer. He said, there's nothing I can talk to Oppenheimer about that he doesn't know as much or more than I do. With one exception, he said, sports. But he was persuaded that Oppenheimer had a vision for this laboratory, which would bring together the achievements of Washington State and Hanford, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, into laboratories in a remote, secluded place that could result in the culmination of billions of dollars being spent, all in secret, in a place that would be comparatively secure. It turned out not to be secure. There were these 4 spies there, not mercenaries. Every one of them were altruists, dedicated to the proposition that Soviet Russia, in fact, should be informed about what was going on. And they were successful. So Groves' effort to make this a place that was totally separate from the protestations and invitations and temptations of Soviet espionage, largely, in fact, was overwhelmed. But nevertheless, the place itself was absolutely remarkable. And I'd like to say just a few things about how the effect of Los Alamos had on the early scientists arriving. Oppenheimer, in fact, was given the post of director of the Los Alamos laboratory, and he began extending invitations to British scientists and also emigre scientists from around the country. They came to Laney, they were transported by bus here. Dorothy McKibben, who was revealed in all of her glory, I think, in Jennifer Conant's East Palace 109. And if you haven't read it, that's East Palace 109, it's a few blocks from here. It's a treat, and enormously informative. And restored to the story of Los Alamos, Dorothy McKibben, who was a Smith graduate, had come to Santa Fe like many people because of lung difficulties in the 1930s, had a son, was looking for employment, and a few feet from here, she met Robert Oppenheimer for the first time. And she said, I never met anyone in my life with more intellectual sex appeal. And this was something that Oppenheimer, in fact, bestowed lavishly on the ladies, in fact, for attracting his mind, charisma, etc. And so she became the gatekeeper of Los Alamos. Oppenheimer had been installed as the head of Los Alamos project. He anticipated there would be about 300 occupants in the early days. By 1945, there were 5,000 people living in Los Alamos in lots of different ways. As Ellen will probably tell you, she and her family lived under tents in Bandolera because there wasn't suitable housing. That was to change later in 27 months. Now, where they went was, of course, as many of us know here, this is not news. Oppenheimer in the 1930s had fallen in love with New Mexico. The Teddy Roosevelt story was to be replicated many times. The frail Eastern youth traveling west and, in fact, finding out what he needed to find out about himself, his own manly prowess, his intellectual successes in different ways, his practicalities. He could manage life in a way that was productive and promising. Oppenheimer, in a sense, every one of those, was somewhat frail estate, certainly very susceptible to various and sundry psychological difficulties. But he came west, fell in love with New Mexico. In the 1930s, as you're going to find in a few minutes, he met Edith Warner at her little humble abode at Otowi Bridge. Now, Oppenheimer's love for New Mexico once prompted him to say, when asked what were his controlling passions, and he said, my passions are twofold. One, New Mexico, and the other, physics. With Oppenheimer accompanying Groves to the Los Alamos Ranch School and deciding, as Rhodes said, this is the place. He in fact was able to find the junction between these two great loves of his life, and therefore, in fact, in every way, was to be fulfilled personally, intellectually, and with a devout sense that what he was doing, in one way or another, was being a good American. Somebody who was assimilating totally the American experience, and to our country was providing a service that possibly could win the most savage of all world wars. Now, the first arriving scientists, arriving, as I said a moment ago, in Laney, were carried by bus up the hill to Los Alamos, living in sort of very primitive conditions. But the impact that it had on these scientists was extraordinary. James Hilton had published a novel 2 or 3 years before called Lost Horizons. Some of you may in fact be familiar with it. It's a very romance novel. It's a great story. Well, this story was sort of part of the intellectual repertoire of popular reading. And when the British scientists got there, many started calling Los Alamos Shangri-La after this divine place in the pages of Hilton's novel. The British physicist James Tuck said, here at Los Alamos, I found the spirit of Athens, of Plato, of the ideal republic. Never before or since afterwards had a congregation of such extraordinary minds become congruent to achieve a single great task. There were 14 Nobel Prize winners, or those who would win the Nobel Prize at Los Alamos during these 27 months. The greatest physicists of the Western world in Germany too. Werner Heisenberg, the great atomic physicist and one-time friend of Niels Bohr, was in Germany, and he was heading the German project. He later said that he had said, and it's highly speculative whether you believe it or not, that he had purposely, in fact, retarded the German efforts to create an atomic bomb. Be that as it may, that constellation of talent at this former rank school at Los Alamos was simply the most extraordinary gatherings of individuals in world history. A rough social democracy prevailed. It was an extraordinary fluid environment. Beverly Agnew, who wrote one of the best memoirs, I think, of life at Los Alamos during these years, was the wife of Harold Agnew, who later became the head of Los Alamos. She was 22 years old. Her husband, Harold, was a graduate student. And she said, this is what it was like on a given evening. There were chaotic days, but for us they were fun. I cooked a lot. It wasn't unusual to have 3 or 4 Nobel Prize winners over for supper, and the conversation was electric and satisfying. It was a conversation that included women. All of the wives, in fact, were told they did not know what their husbands were doing. But Eleanor may tell us more about that, how much her mother knew about the project. Now, it was a young community. The average age was 27, a population of 5,000. And one lab wrote, after the 174 births in 27 months, the following. The journal's in a stew. He trusted you and you. He thought you'd be scientific. Instead, you're just prolific. Now, the scientists at Los Alamos were overwhelmingly confident that a bomb could soon be made. Robert Oppenheimer himself had difficulties with the authorities at Los Alamos because he had a very complicated left-wing past. And that was to haunt him throughout the years, his great years after the war, as well as during the war, and ultimately, in fact, bringing him to lose his security clearance in 1954. Now, at Los Alamos, they were constantly tied to a radio that in fact kept the scientists apprised of what was happening in Europe. In 1944, on June 6, as we all know, this was the invasion of Europe. And the war, in fact, was to go on to other tragedies before its final conclusion. But the report that resulted, led by a scientist called Samuel Goldsmith, who had been a classmate of Oppenheimer's at the University of Edinburgh, he had taken a jeep and a couple of soldiers, plunged into Germany to find out how far the Germans had come in their atomic project, and he discovered they'd made almost no progress. He notified his colleagues at Los Alamos, we won't have to use the bomb. The Germans had failed, the Allies had succeeded in creating an atomic weapon. Now we know this was not the case, but so it seemed in that fragment of a moment that there might be a possibility of looking at this whole endeavor in a way that would not result in the destruction of populations, but perhaps a demonstration shot. And that argument was to go on in the summer of 1945 with a velocity among scientists, a few at Los Alamos and some in Chicago, that in fact had its own igniting effect from the conversation of the scientists. Should this bomb be used against a population target? Now, thus we have success had been achieved in separating U-235 from its parent element. The scientists were so certain that a uranium bomb could be made that it was not even attempted to have an experiment with it. It was very simple, and they were absolutely convinced that it would be effective. That was the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. Well, Nagasaki was a very different bomb. The element was called plutonium. It was made in laboratories, and therefore it did not have to be extracted from the parent element. So the plutonium bomb was the first time it was used was against Nagasaki. Now, Oppenheimer quickly informed his colleagues at Los Alamos of the message from Washington. And the message was this, and it was absolutely imperative on the part of the government to persuade the scientists who had engaged in this extraordinary project to see it through to its completion, and the bomb that was the U.S. government can investigate and invested millions of dollars to be used against now Japan. Now, the message that he read over microphones at Los Alamos was the following. We still have a war against Japan to win. The work you were doing must continue without interruption or delay, and it must continue in secret. Every man-hour of work will help smash Japan and bring our fighting boys home. There must not be a let-up, nor was there. The scientists in Chicago had largely completed their work. So at Los Alamos, in those extraordinary days in the summer of 1945, the work was absolutely endless. It wasn't, in fact, that there weren't times for recreation. There was a famous composition of alcohol. There was enough to blow a hole, certainly in the normal personalities of Los Alamos scientists, as large as, in fact, the first atomic weapon. The alcohol that was brewed in the labs was formidable in the extreme. That being said, they worked every day, and many, many hours each day. And the work, if anything, was even more frenetic, leading up in July to the first experiment, the so-called Trinity site. And we're going to see in just a few minutes at least a few images of that. And that, in fact, was astonishing to all. There were all sorts of prognostications about what would happen. Edward Teller said it would probably destroy New Mexico. And then Hans Bethe came in and did other calculations, and he said in all likelihood it wouldn't. So as we are here today, that prophecy has been verified. Now the war in Europe ended in 1945 with suicide. So Japan was there, and the fighting in the Pacific had grown more and more intense. My father had been in North Africa for most of the war. He'd been part of something called the Desert Air Force, which complemented the British forces, particularly at the Battle of El Alamein. He'd come back to the United States and join a unit called the 393rd Bomb Group. It was an elite unit. It was chaired by an old friend of his, or commanded by an old friend of his. And that unit was picked out of all the Air Corps units in the United States to be the foundation stone of the 519 composite bomber. They trained for 6 months and went over Utah. It was a place that was desolate then and now beyond believing. It was my first year in school, and I was extremely bored with all the secrecy. Plus, we had neighbors called Paul Tibbets and his wife. Tibbets was the commander of the 519. He flew the plane against Hiroshima and became world famous, positively and negatively in the years afterwards. But what I knew about them was the ferocious arguments between the two of them, because we slept in, or we stayed in basically certain huts with certain wallpaper separating the huts who needed the living quarters from each other. So the arguments were long and loud. Later on, there was a film made about Tibbets in which they reconciled at the end of the film. But I, as a 6-year-old, was not confident that the relationship was going to survive. But Tibbets, in fact, was the main figure. He was leading a famous pilot in Europe and had commanded this unit for 6 months. As a child, in fact, I had some feeling of magnetic attraction to landscape, to the extent I decided to leave home one day. And I got an Indian headdress, I got a wooden axe, and I got a bunch of it. And I decided I was leaving all this and was going to make my own life. I got away at 200 or 300 yards, and I'll never forget my father returning home at night, running up the hillside to this little encampment that I made. I had no idea what I was doing the next day. And he started laughing, but he took out his belt with the sliver of metal at the end and told me my errant ways. But it was a place that in one way or another I knew was strange, had a surreal quality, And like anybody who was alive during World War II, the news are more incisive, more colorful, if you will. And so that time while I was a child, I come back with extraordinary, breathtaking tactility of what it was like living there, living next to those people who could change the world. And my father, in fact, stayed as long as he could. My mother returned to home in East Texas. She was pregnant with my daughter, Kat. My father was able to separate from the unit in '88 and be there for the birth. But my sister was not born until the 10th, so he had to return, and we were off to Kenya, and then the attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, with the success of the Trinity explosion, Otto Frisch, who with his aunt Lisa Meitner, great physicist and astrophysicist himself, had decided to be with the Los Alamos project, and he said this at the moment that the Trinity shot had exploded, enhancing their expectations, but also in fact a tremendous sense of relief that Mexico was still here. He said, and then without a word the sun was shining, or so it looked. The sand hills at the edge of the desert were shimmering in very bright light, almost colorless and shapeless. I turned around, but that object on the horizon which looked like a small sun was still too bright to look at. I kept blinking and trying to take looks. And after another 10 seconds or so, it had grown and dimmed into something like a huge coral fire. It was an awesome spectacle, and all in complete silence. The bang came minutes later, and quite loud enough that I plugged my ears, and followed by a long, heavy rumble of like heavy traffic very far away. And then he said, I can still hear it. And then, as his friends in fact were preparing tables here at Fonda, he said, I look at my friends who were responsible for this great accomplishment, and he said, I'm sick to my stomach. Fonda played an important role in the story in terms of relief time, in terms of economic agency by hospital workers, bartenders, but it was the place, along with Edith Warner's humble Bridge, that allowed them a sense of relief and a sense of reconnecting with humanity as opposed to the abstract qualities of the work in the workroom. Now, news of the trial, of the successful trial of Almagardo in July 15th, convinced Truman, who was on his way to Potsdam to meet with Stalin, that in fact he had the card in his hands. And what he didn't know was that Stalin knew all about it. The four spies that I mentioned that in fact in one way or another had managed to get most of this information out. Klaus Fuchs, perhaps the most notable one, found a stratagem for getting his own mathematical work out of Los Alamos. He wrote it in hand, and the only thing that was checked is that which was typewritten. So he was able to walk out and follow his notes, borrowed Richard Feynman's car. Feynman was later with the prize, drove to Albuquerque, and met with Harry Gold. And all this information that was very soon in Soviet hands. Now, Oppenheimer's complicated political past for a while was forgotten or put aside. With the war ending, he became the most famous, after Einstein, most famous scientist in the world. His face was in the cover of Life magazine, on Time magazine, the father of the atomic bomb. And he entered a period of influence and celebrity that in fact elevated the scientist to a role in public life that previously had not been his or her destiny. The scientist, the citizen. And a lot of this, the principles, the architecture of his own worldview came very directly from his school experiences in New York, in the Phoenix Catholic schools. What Oppenheimer offered was a vision that transcended the individual. And he brought that vision to Los Alamos. In certain ways, as one of them said unforgettably, what Oppenheimer brought to me was a vision of myself that was almost poetic. There we were, devoting our labors and our energies and our talents to a cause that he led us to believe, in fact, was the greatest thing we could ever do in our lives. So Oppenheimer's influence, in fact, was to extend to an extraordinary degree. He had a remarkable lexicon of reading and philosophy. He learned Sanskrit to learn to read the Bhagavad Gita, which we're going to be introduced to in 1 second. And he was able to bring to his own public statements about the scientist of modern life that made him the most influential scientist in the world in the years after 1945. Within 9 years, he was to have the security clearance stripped from him and to be publicly humiliated. All because of his complex relationships with the Communist Party in the past. He was never a communist himself. But what happened was that he was particularly violently indiscreet in a number of different ways. And with the McCarthy Red Scare going on, Oppenheimer was his most prominent victim. And even today, efforts are being made to somehow absolve this. As one dissenting vote in the decision to strip Oppenheimer's security clearance said, this is a black mark on our escutcheon of the United States. Two others disagreed with him, and so Oppenheimer's security clearance was lifted. And so what we have in closing is, I think these are the reflections. There might be any number of words that bring candidates to conclude my remarks this afternoon. I think of two. I. Raby, his great friend. And Raby became universally admired for his wisdom as well as his scientific genius. He said simply, the story of Los Alamos was one of human greatness and human folly. The second voice, that of Richard Rose, put it differently. And he wrote that most of all, the Manhattan Project must be seen as intensely human, and from the beginning compelled not by malice or hatred, but by hope for a better world. So it seems to me that it's with the greatest humility that we must see those who toiled for more than 2 years in this austere, beautiful mesa that once housed a boys' school, whose desire to uncover the secrets of the natural world, and so doing serve the cause of humanity, forever change the world for themselves and all who came after them. In conclusion, it's a story that is tragic. It talks about the aspiration of human greatness. It talked about the ways in which, in one way or another, that the individual human being can be tied into the collectivity of individuals to do things they never imagined possible, for good and for ill. But the lenses that we're looking at this today, first, Oppenheimer, looking at this as his great experience as an American, a contribution to American life and America's future. On the other hand, a woman living in a very simple, devoted dwelling, who also perceived this through her own lens. And what we're looking at, I think, in a unique way today, and it's been great fun discussing what we're doing this afternoon with my colleagues, because we're looking at Los Alamos not exclusive to the eyes of the great scientists or those who vilified them and said that all communists were something to do. We're not communists, but in fact we're accused of that, for participating in something that we're assuming was in the hands of the Russians. But from another person who was rich in her own individuality in a way that Oppenheimer was himself, but brought to these scientists a humanity, a compassion for life, and a sense of connectedness with the natural world that ultimately, in fact, proved herself to be an important part of the Los Alamos story. So, in conclusion, last words, what Oppenheimer said after his loss of security clearance, he said something about ourselves with the result that we will begin to reknit human nature, and by the insight and wonder of the world of nature, as science has revealed it, into relevance and meaning for the intellectual life, the spiritual life of man. Robert Oppenheimer made extraordinary proportions and great effects, but in one way or another was to push science into a new understanding of what it meant and science's relationship with government and with our collective futures. Thank you very much. And we're going to talk I'd like to add one more thing to her biography. Ellen's done many things, all of them extremely well. But we may not know that she contributed a very important article to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. She comes from a family of scientists, and I once asked her brother-in-law, who's a physicist, if he'd ever published in the Bulletin of Atomic Science. And he said no, but Ellen has. And she reconfigured her understanding of the Nagasaki mission, which had been cloaked in all sorts of secrecy, lack of clarity, and she was able to bring a clarity to that mission that finally resolved some of the questions. Important article, and
thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So we're moving so that
You're going to announce the video?
Yeah. This is for the Okay. And this is Trinity Site in Georgia.
I remember as we first responded to the question, what do scientists think, by saying that they think a variety of things, and this is only natural. On the one hand, they hoped that this instrument would never be used in war, and therefore they hoped that we would not start out by using it.
scientists are working under growing pressure. They are told there must be no further delays. The President must know the results of the test when he meets with some. In mid-July, a car arrives at the test site. In the back seat is the plutonium for the bomb. It is 48 hours before H hour at ground zero. Sunday, July 15, 1945, Alamogordo, New Mexico. It is D-1 for the test of the world's first atomic device. In the bunkers, the scientists and the generals wait. No one is quite sure that the $2 billion device they call the gadget will work. The weather is checked. Preparations continue. The scientists make up a pool on the power of the device. Fermi suggests it may blow up New Mexico. As the waiting goes on, the tension increases.
My hands were on the switch, and I could hear the timer coming. 3, 2, 1. Flash of light. Everything. Many times wide to the sunlight does in New Mexico, and I couldn't know where I'd be. Many miles of the desert were completely blind, and so I actually lost my vision for a few seconds. When it recovered, I turned back, and I saw a huge ball of fire, bright yellow, rising through the atmosphere, and the whole atmosphere in the direction of the bomb was filled with strange violet lines. It was one of the most especially beautiful things I've ever seen on an enormous scale. Was about pink, purple. I knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
A few seconds after this,
Microphone.
sorry. A few seconds after Oppenheimer's reference to Sanskrit and the Bhagavad Gita, one of his friends said more vernacular now. He said, "Abhi, we're all sons of bitches now."
Now, whoops, thanks, that's good, I'm going to sit back down. So, I'm not going to stand up. What, out of a lot. I think, you know most of that story, but this, particularly today, when everybody's rattling nuclear weapons around, it's interesting to look back at that very beginning where they're pretty, well, Norris Bradbury said to me once, he said, "We were pretty sure it would work, but pretty sure is not enough." So, anyway, what I would add just a little bit of this is more about Miss Warner now, because we were kids and she was older, we called her Miss Warner. So now we're older, we still call her Miss Warner. But she had, as you all probably know, a little tea room. She had started in an almost pathetic attempt to figure a way to stay in New Mexico and make at least a rudimentary living. And she had been running a kind of a station, I think, so that the freight that was to go perhaps to Los Alamos wasn't stolen. It was where it was offline, loaded on the Chile line, and then carted up to the boys' school. So after everything shut down, Los Alamos, Oppenheimer realized that she wouldn't have a living. There was no income at all. She had very little. So he said, why don't you just serve dinner? She was famous for this chocolate cake that she made. And so she began having dinners that you had to call and make a reservation. Now, calling at Los Alamos, we did not have telephones. We did not have cameras. I got a security clearance when I was 6. Of course, I wanted to be a spy. What was the most interesting thing? But this tea room had an almost magical significance to the people up there. It was, out of Los Alamos. Los Alamos, of course, had a big fence around it. We had MPs driving around all the time, and you had to show your pass to get in and out. And there were some places in Santa Fe, Dorothy McKibben's house, 109 East Palace. You wouldn't have a discussion there because two tiny rooms. But that was the address that you reported to. And our parents went sometimes down to have dinner at Miss Warner's, and Tolano was her Indian companion. Now I will address this as, say I'm in 6th or 7th grade, it finally occurs to me, well, she's living with this Indian man, huh? That's pretty interesting. So I asked our neighbor, Mrs. Froman, did she think they were married? And she said, no, they're just very good friends. That was the end of it. So, but anyway, before we turn it over to Alton and Bruce, I wanted to read just a little bit out of one of her, well, actually, it's a letter by Philip Morris. No, all right. So Philip Morrison was one of the many scientists who went down. He wrote this letter after the war to Miss Warner. You will realize that we have all been changed by our years on the Mesa. I have to read this without crying. It's sad. We worked passionately for the great end we achieved, knowing that it was really no end, but a means. In that work, we changed. We had all to learn again, in all its meanings, how strong is the bond between science and the life of men. We shall never forget our time on the Hill. The time was made of long nights, long hours, critical discussions, busy desert days, and patient waiting in the laboratory. It held the terrible suspense of the last minutes at Trinity. There was more. We lived in a community. We grew to know each other. Before that was hardly novel. Most of us had known each other long before Los Alamos. What was new was the life around us that we began to share. We learned to watch the snow on the Sangres and look for the deer in Water Canyon. We found that on the mesas and the valleys there was an old and strange culture. There were our neighbors, the people around in the pueblos, and there were the caves in Otowi Canyon to remind us that other men had sought water in the dry land. Not the smallest part of the life we came to lead, Miss Warner, was you. Evenings in your place by the river, by the table so neatly set, before the fireplace so carefully conceived, gave us a little of your assurance, allowed us to belong, took us from the green temporary houses and bulldozed roads. We shall not forget. It was a terrible irony that brought the makers of the bomb to the quiet Otowi crossing. It would have been easy for you to reject our problem. You could have drawn away from the Hill people, their concerns, and remained in the compact life of the valley. But you did not. We take from that the hope that the people of intelligence and goodwill everywhere will understand and share our sense of crisis in the in the hope that in that hope lies the world's best assurance. I am glad that at the foot of our canyons there was a house where the spirit of Boer is so well understood. Almost 14 years later, I wrote Dr. Morrison for permission to use these words, and he wrote this to Peggy Pond Church. Miss Warner, her house by the river, her spirit of grace, remained a part of everyone at Los Alamos, and luckily enough, we have all known her. Edith Warner stands in the history of those desperate times as a kind of rainbow, a sign that war and bombs are not all that men and women are capable of building. So now we have these two guys. They have separately, perhaps together, undertaken to make a film of this story. So, you want to start, please?
Sure. Everybody hear me? Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Gelfand. I'm a writer, and I wrote a movie based on this book, The House at Otowi Bridge, Peggy Pond Church's book. By the way, is Peggy Pond Church's any relatives in the room? We actually heard there was her relatives were in town. I wanted to actually meet them face to face because I've been sending them money every year for the last 20 years. Is there a hand?
There's one hand.
Wow.
Well, it's not a relative, but it's someone who actually served tea to Peggy Pond at the house.
Wow. So we'll get to that in a few minutes, okay? So why was I drawn to this? First of all, thank you to you guys, Ellen, Jim, and to the folks at La Fonda. You guys, Philip, wherever you are, and it feels I'm honored to be here, honestly, and it feels a little bit like a dream because this book landed on me in 1987, and I heard her voice and wouldn't let me go. She wouldn't let me go. I was talking to a production designer named Rob King, who works a lot here in New Mexico, and we were talking about the script, and the last line of my screenplay is home. And I made the point to him, as the production designer, this is a movie, to me at the core, about a woman who's looking for home, looking for a sanctuary in this world that we live in, and that she was looking for. And one of the extraordinary things about her is that she found a home by making a home for all these other people. A home for all these other people in the most difficult and stressful and unsafe times. And it didn't matter whether you were Native American or you were one of the scientists from the Hill. Her heart was big enough to actually hold both sides. And for me, one of the reasons this voice in this book wouldn't let me go, and this story wouldn't let me go, is that this story has always been told through Oppenheimer's eyes, rightfully so. He's the most interesting, in some ways the most colorful and dramatic character. It's never been, and so there's the same kind of paradigm. And it's never been told through a woman's eyes. It's never been told through Native American eyes, they're all part of the story. And that part of the story, that part of history, has never been dramatized in this regard. And so I was very moved by that. I'm very moved by the way history gets told, who tells it, and her voice. She's always felt to me like a great American heroine who nobody knows, and who was creating a safe place during the time for a lot of people, a lot of refugees. These were all homeless people. These were all refugees. These scientists, they were far away from home, and they were engaged in arguably the most dangerous event in the history of our lives. And she was making them dinner, and she was holding space for them. And Tolano, her Native American friend, was her partner in that. And for him to be doing that is also extraordinary. His journey in this story is extraordinary. She also struck up an extraordinary relationship with Niels Bohr, who was there under an assumed name. And that triangle of energies is what really drew me to the story. How that triangle, I mean, here's a man trying to get to God through his brain, and here's a man trying to get to God through his body, through the earth. And here's this woman who's the heart that connects these two. And, you know, and they all wrote about it after the war. A lot of them were in love with her. I literally had interviews with scientists who'd been there that told me stories, wild and crazy stories about the nights in Edith's tea room. And, you know, look, Vladimir Putin is rattling nuclear, you know, sabers today. We live in a very dangerous world where we still live inside the shadow of this event. And you can draw a straight line from that conversation, this white, you know, crazy guy who thinks the world is a certain way, all the way back to the arguments these guys were having in her tea room 75 years ago. And one of the things that's also really been moving to me is that the Native American presence that held it all, that was here long before they came and will be here long after we've left. And the wisdom of, we have things, we need to learn things that they know. And she knew that. She knew that almost from the beginning. And again, it makes her an extraordinary model. And for the history to be told in a new way, this history to be told in a new way. So, you know, I'll give Alton a chance to talk. But it's always felt like an honor and a privilege to hold, to want to tell her story. And it's a challenging story to be told because I have a lot of crazy Hollywood stories around this, what people wanted to turn this into. And I actually believe it's never been more relevant. The market has finally caught up with the material. And I'm very excited to be here, and we're in the process of, we're going to make this movie. So, with your help as well. Because the other thing is, this is not a Hollywood movie. This is a New Mexico movie. And the people who are going to make it are here. Honestly, this is a baked on premises thing. And that fills me with great joy and great pride. So thank you. And please.
You're very patient people. You've heard some great stories. My name is Alton Walpole. I'm a native New Mexican. I was raised in a little tiny town in New Mexico called Mountain Air. And I think most of us that are my age or so have lived through this story from children to our adulthood now. And hopefully the younger generation now can take this information and do something with it in the future for all of us. It's very interesting to hear all the stories about Los Alamos. I came to this story many years ago through Frank Waters, who was a writer that lived in the northern part of New Mexico. He'd written some screenplays and he's written quite a few books. The Man Who Killed the Deer, the Book of the Hopi. And he was an information officer for Los Alamos and actually knew Edith Warner because he was back and forth to Los Alamos. And his writing about Otowi Crossing and Los Alamos was kind of destroyed because at the time it was so secret that his work was edited and re-edited and edited because there was a huge fear by the publishers that he was revealing secrets that he shouldn't reveal. And so, you know, that's kind of was his story. Frank Waters passed away, and then there was an opera made from his book in St. Louis. I was fortunate enough to go with his wife to that. But the story stayed with me because Edith Warner is really us, in a certain way. We lived through a time that this happened. And it was mostly men that developed this, and scientists. And they thought they were saving the world. It was a conflict. It was hard. But it was competitive. I think when Jim said that They thought the person that, or the country, or the place, or the people that figured out splitting the atom and making this bomb, they were going to win. That's who was going to win. Edith Warner was not about winning. She was about understanding. She was about spirit. And as Bruce said, living there and bringing all those groups together in her tea room is the real story about what happened. And the story that we as New Mexicans probably need to know. It probably needs to be shared. Not the story of Oppenheimer. That's important. The story of the atomic bomb or the story of the war. Those are all important. But personally, when Bruce says it feels like home, I think that's the story we need to know about. And I think the media in this country has not allowed that to happen as much as it should. It's all about winning. It's about competition. It's about warfare. And it's about men. Maybe now is the time for that to change a bit. And so that's why I'm here, just to support this situation, support this film, and to hopefully, learn something myself. And I learned a lot from what Jim and Helen said today, and Bruce. And I hope we all did. And thank you for coming.
We can move to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, we'd love to hear you. Just stand up and raise your hand and we'll go back and forth, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Working title on the film?
Let's use the mic because they're filming. So if you don't mind talking into a microphone.
Thank you.
Is a working title on the film?
It's very clever. It's The House at Otowi Bridge.
I would say one thing, that there's several things. I think Otowi is a really important word, and it's a word that people really haven't heard very much. It means the place where the river makes a noise, which is also a little bit too poetic for this kind of idea. But that I think taking the title from the book is the right thing to do.
Are we have a question over there?
Yes, my name is Julie Hawkins Melton. My father was historian of the war years at Los Alamos, and I spent, like Ellen, my early years, very early years, in Los Alamos. And I remember Edith very well, although my parents used to grumble they didn't have enough money from my dad's salary to go to eat there very often. And then when I was about 8 or 9 and we were living in Boulder, I just wanted to share this. We went and visited her with Tilano. She was still there, even though we didn't live in Los Alamos anymore. And I just remember her as an incredibly warm, enveloping person, whomever you were, whether you were an 8-year-old or, and my parents had this bond with her, even though they couldn't go eat there very often. I just wanted to add that personal note.
Thank you. We have a mailing list here. It's on this clipboard if you want to stay engaged. We're going to do more screenings and more conversations here at La Fonda. They would love to host us here. We cannot be more appreciative of that. So if you want to get up to date when we're going to be here, we're going to just pass that around and feel free to sign up. Yes, you have a question. Let's use a microphone if you don't mind.
I was very curious about the quote from Oppenheimer at the end of his talk. We weren't able to hear it because of the microphone, but what he said after he lost his clearance, I'd love to hear what that was.
As I said, Oppenheimer in that 9-year period, 1945 to 1954, went from being the most renowned scientist and scientific statesman in the world. Sore throat and up here.
He's getting to the microphone.
Is this any better?
Speak into the microphone.
I mentioned that I think I mentioned Oppenheimer.
Jim, you gotta lean into this. Yeah, like that.
Okay, is that it?
Well, one of the things that was very much a part of Oppenheimer, one of the things that was very significant part of Oppenheimer's personality was arrogance. He had a tendency to make people feel foolish, and one of his mortal enemies was a man called Louis Strauss. Strauss and he had worked reasonably happily together, but Oppenheimer embarrassed him in a congressional hearing. And when Oppenheimer was leaving the hearing, he asked one of his friends how well he had done. And he said, Oppie, you did too well. And Strauss declared at that point that Oppenheimer was going to be his target. And you've got to keep in mind what the climate was. Naming names, the Hollywood 10, any kind of communist association, even if you've seen the Lucille Ball film, you may recall that all took place in a week in which it was revealed she had some connection with the Communist Party. And the result of all this was the destruction of careers. Oppenheimer's brother was 1 week away from getting tenure in the physics department at the University of Minnesota when this all exploded. He was a Communist Party member. His wife was a Communist Party member. Oppenheimer's closest friend, Hakon Chevalier, probably a Communist member, certainly left wing, and so on. So Oppenheimer had all of these connections with communist folk, both in his family and outside. He once said that he belonged to every communist-run organization on the West Coast, but was never a communist himself. So all this, in fact, came together with the personal enmity of Louis Strauss. And Oppenheimer collapsed. At one point, I hope to point out that Rabbi understood Oppenheimer, I think, better than almost anyone. He said Oppenheimer was not a coherent personality. That what Rabbi had, in contrast, although he was not a formal Jew in terms of practicing, was a cohering principle in his life that is Jewishness gave him a sense of identity, a sense of having a foundation. And in Oppenheimer's case, he said, by contrast, Oppenheimer never had that foundation. And the result was he was a man of parts. And he said, by that I mean splinters. He never cohered as a personality. And the result was he was a person who could create himself in the moment. Los Alamos was the biggest stage of any scientist's life. And on that stage, his genius, his extraordinary personal qualities, in fact, had a kind of fulfillment, and it was a performance of a lifetime. But when he was called up before the ABC committee, that collapsed. He was completely helpless in the face of this. His wife, Kitty, who in many ways had her own issues, was a stalwart during this time. But Oppenheimer completely folded during this week in which he testified to his accusers. And the result was, by a vote of 2-1, his security clearance was taken from him. And this over a 9-year period from the absolute apogee of any scientist's career as a citizen statesman. And that was a genius after 1945. If he had lived long enough, he might have gotten the Nobel Prize for his work on dark matter. But in his own lifetime, this is where the genius really was. He could speak of science and its relationship to the natural world and our place in it as human beings in a way that no other scientist in the world could. And yet, during that time, which the stage had quieted, the curtain had dropped, and he was facing his accusers, this was a moment in which who he was proved to be as fragile as it was. So overnight, he lost his security clearance, humiliated. George Kennan, the famous author of The Container Theory of the Russians, asked Oppenheimer, he said, why don't you leave this country? And Oppenheimer said, because I love this country, I'm not going to leave it. So it's a tragedy of the first order, and I'm sorry if many of you couldn't hear this.
I just want to add something.
It's a little Oppenheimer story, because Jim is sitting over there. After Oppenheimer lost his clearance, he would come back to Los Alamos, and if you lose your clearance, you can't go behind the fence. It really cuts you off. So the Bradburys were having a party, and something that Claire Ulam and I said, as kids, we thought what happened at a party was the men went down by the barbecue and talked, and we were supposed to be serving hors d'oeuvres or something. And, but it wasn't like a coherent party. It was the way parties were a lot of times. Anyway, so Oppie came back up to the house, maybe to go to the bathroom, I don't know. Anyway, he was standing in the living room alone, and I had, by an accident, seen the films of Nagasaki, Hiroshima. They were unedited, just the people after the bomb walking around, their skin falling off. Anyway, I was horrified. So I had worried about it, and I talked to people, and they said, well, you should ask Oppie. So there was Oppenheimer standing there. So I went and offered him whatever, a deviled egg or something. And I said, and I think you're some sort of a saint. I was 15. And he was shocked, and he said, well, why would you ever say that to me? And I said, because you had second thoughts. And he turned around and walked out of the party. So, I mean, that was, I think, a dart from an unexpected place. He was in a place where he was revered and beloved. And here's this little numbskull wandering around. Do you think this is a good idea? Anyway, I think for all of us, it has that sort of resonance.
Thank you, Ellen. There's some questions here. Let's get some questions from folks. So we have one right here. And there's a lot of interest in the movie. The clipboard is going around. We'll be here afterwards if you want to sign and stay up to date with information. But here's a question.
Hi, my name is Cindy Pabst. I'm over here. And I wanted you to tell that story, because I know that story, but also, could you tell the Nagasaki story very quickly?
Oh, that's such a long story.
It is, so if you can't do that, can anyone speak about how Miss Warner responded to Oppenheimer when he was going through his difficult times, and if she reached out to him, and she sounds like a very empathetic character, so I just wanted to know that. But if you can't tell the Nagasaki story, that's too bad, because it's such a great story.
I don't know. Does anybody here? Julie? Julie, yeah.
I have a letter that was written to Oppenheimer from Edith Warner later. And it was great to hear you call him Oppie, because that's what she called him. She called him Oppie, not Oppenheimer, but Oppie. And I think that I don't know for sure, but from the tenor of the letter, she was very much in favor of humanity and life and discovery. And she was opposed to dropping this bomb. She was really opposed to that. But she loved the people. And I think that's the main part of her story. She really cared for these men from the Pueblo, from Los Alamos on the hill, the scientists, and she called him Oppie, which is something that maybe makes you feel like a real affinity with that person in that way. I would also encourage you real quickly, I want to just say that if you haven't read any of there's quite a few books written about the whole situation, and besides Peggy Von Church's book of poetry and Frank Waters' book about her, there's a book called Standing By and Making Do, which you should read. And it was written it's about the women of the scientists of Los Alamos. That title says a lot. Standing By and Making Do. And there are other books too, which were mentioned today, the Post Office Box at 109 East Palace. And if you're really interested in the story, you should read everything you can, because it's an incredible story. And we as the Mexicans, it's a real part of our life and our history here. So I encourage you to do that.
We've got another question over by Justin.
Hi. When I first moved to Santa Fe, I listened to the book on tape. And then shortly after that, it could have been 28 or 29 years ago, I was the Fine Art Museum at that time. There was an experience of being in the cafe, and the museum was kind of dark, and there were tables with scribbled notes and equations, I think, projected on the walls, and the voices of the people talking in secrecy, really low. And I see you shaking your head out. Do you remember that?
I do.
It was quite an immersive experience. I mean, there's lots of great stories that we're hearing. it would be great to add an immersive sort of experience to the film or the trailer, or just do it here, you know, because that really made me understand what I had heard in the book. So just
You
wanted
know,
to throw that in.
if I can say, because part of my job, dramatizing the story, is to recreate that, so that the audience, so that you're there in the tea room, and you're experiencing it the way Edith and Tolano experienced it, which is, there's a lot of secrecy, there's a lot of eavesdropping, there's a lot of people getting a little too drunk and saying a little too much. And information is starting to leak out in spite of all of the rules. And here are these two people serving dinner as this is happening, and who are completely oblivious, really don't know what's going on up on the hill, have their ideas and their fears. And that's very much at the center of the drama. Those nights in her tea room, and all the rock star scientists gathered around the table, you know, scribbling things, arguing about things, joking about things, and they're all witnesses. We're witnesses through Edith's eyes. So, meanwhile, her Native American friends are next door, living in an entirely different kind of faith and religion. And so, the collision of those two worlds is really exciting, I think.
We have another question over here.
Hi, I just wanted to know what's going on with Edith's house today. Is it, I mean, you can drive right...
Nothing. The Indians are going to let it go back to the ground.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Are you able to get in there to do any filming?
No.
No, but we have a dream of turning it into a kind of a museum where that is the place where Edith Warner lived. And if we make this movie and we don't screw it up and it takes off and people suddenly her name and people are interested in who this woman was, they can come here and visit. And I mean, obviously there's a lot of moving parts here, but the idea of having a living museum in her name, where the tea room used to be, is an immersive experience that can move forward. So that's one of the things we're playing with. You know, yeah.
We have another question over there.
What is the status of the movie? Do you have funding? Do you have people working on it?
I don't know. How much money do you got? We have development funding. We're in the process of putting together all the tools we need to go out and get big funding. Schedule, budget, you know, marketing tools, the screenplay. So that, I mean, part of the reason we're here is to begin to, you know, find allies who are interested in the movie, interested in the story, and interested in it being told on a big screen. Yeah, so I don't know if that answered your question. We're looking for money. Yeah.
Not just money, we're also looking for people that want this story to be told. That comes with community, that comes with resources, that comes with support on the ground level. On the we want this to happen, how can we help you level?
Yeah.
So that's what this is also about. Are there more questions? Anyone else with a raised hand?
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank Fonda so much.